I mean, would you take a bunch of 9-year-olds and let them interact with their peers for 5 hours straight without supervision? That would be crazy. But yet that's what we're doing. We're letting them interact with their peers for hours and hours and hours at a time without any supervision.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Your Business, Your Next Level. I'm your host, Unicia Brett, and today I have Stacy Pellettieri in the studio with me. She's a licensed clinical social worker with over 28 years of experience owning 5 businesses in the mental health space. She owns and runs group psychotherapy practices as well as school-based mental health programs. She brings really deep expertise in the areas of trauma, the youth mental health crisis, ADHD, parenting, and many others. Stacy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I am too, because when I was reading through your bio and I kind of sat and I observed and looked at our discussion, my thought was there are so many individuals, and I see this all the time, especially with the entrepreneurs, because that's who we serve, in the area of trauma. And we won't dive straight into that, but I got really excited because that's something that I see people do not know how to deal with. It's something that constantly goes under the rug, and well, it creates issues. Before we go there though, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how are you managing owning 5 different businesses across in the same area of practice, but with different slants to them?
That's a great question. How am I managing 5 different businesses? I've been blessed to really find the deep passion at my core, what really drives me, what's important to me. I feel blessed in the fact that I am able to really do for a living what I love and am passionate about. I've been able to combine the two together. And I think in that space, I thrive. I thrive in doing what is important to me. And, for me, it's like I see a need for something and I say, there's a need there, I've noticed. And so we need to do something about that. And so all of the businesses I've started have really spun off of the need I've seen in the current business I've had. So for example, I own a very large group private practice on Long Island. And through owning that very large group private practice on Long Island, seeing the overwhelming need for more school-based mental health programs, I then started a business that is really primarily circling around school-based mental health programs, and also seeing an enormous need for more work in the ADHD space, coaching and education and all of that. I started a business based off of that. So I'm the kind of person where if I see that there's a need for something, I want to do something about it. So I'm definitely one of those social workers that has kind of moved from the micro space into the macro. And I feel like for me, although I absolutely love being a therapist and sitting one-on-one in a room with somebody, and I've done that for 28 years now, I'm now at a point where I absolutely love being able to make a larger impact and help people on a larger scale. And I have found that through the ability to be able to start a business, you are able to help so many more people. And so I look at each business as an opportunity to help more people. And so if I have the means with which to do that, for me, I say, yes, let's go for it. And I think the other way that I manage it, aside from it just being so much passion driven and so satisfying for me, is I know what my strengths are and what my strengths are not. I know where I need to hire the right people to work with me. And I know how to bring people into leadership where I'm not the only one leading. I have people who lead alongside me in these businesses, and I would not be able to do it without them.
As you're speaking, one of the things that comes to mind, you stated it so beautifully, is that opportunity and the ability to partner and rely on others to do the things that need to be done with excellence, either because maybe it's just not your area of focus or your desired area of focus. We see that as a parallel in our world. And recently I was having a conversation with, interestingly enough, a CPA. We deal with a lot of CPAs, and we were in a mastermind together, and the CPA looks at me as he's speaking with the mastermind host, and he said, Unicia here knows how hard it is to find really good CPAs that don't just do taxes. Everybody can do taxes, but that really understand the tax code. And the mastermind host looked at me and he's like, how bad can it be? I said, they are harder to find than pure gold. And he was like, really? I said, yes, because the reality is you're trusting that person with something that is very, very sensitive and it needs to be handled with care because otherwise it can blow up in your face. When we're talking about mental health, I can only imagine how much bigger an impact that makes if you're not working with the right people.
Oh my gosh, 100%, right? We need to have clinicians that really know what they're doing. And the reality is there's so many different, you talked about trauma, no two people are walking the same experience and living the same experience. Even if you have two different people who have been through a similar experience, it's not going to hit their nervous system the same way. And so we need to have clinicians that are trained in so many different, modalities and have so many different areas of expertise. And so having, different people who have different areas of expertise and different, you talk about excellence, right? Different areas of excellence and different passions and different things that drive them is really what helps us when a patient calls to match them with the right person. And so, I can't be the one to help everybody or be the one to, treat every patient that calls, but finding good, talented clinicians is a big part of what makes the business successful.
Absolutely, 100%. Talk to us, Stacy, a little bit about the trauma. You mentioned, and this is real, it hits everybody's nervous system differently. We see, especially in our world, I always get kind of tickled when people say, money mindset and what were you told when you were a child? Money doesn't grow on trees or whatever they were told, right? And people are actually impacted by that. And that's on the financial side. The thing is that people deal with some big things outside of how their parents might have talked about money. They're dealing with things that might have happened to them. And in many cases, they either never really coped with them, or whenever they surface up, the next thing that they do is they siphon them down. Talk to us a little bit about what have you seen? And obviously we're not treating anybody on the podcast. However, I would love for the entrepreneurs that are listening, they're successful, exceptionally successful in their own right, and they're still struggling. Everybody is. If someone hasn't really dealt with the traumas that they might have experienced, knowingly or unknowingly, what would be something that you would recommend that they do so that they can get to processing those traumas and be able to move on the other side?
I love that question, to talk about this from the perspective of how, we can help an entrepreneur to be more aware of their trauma, I think is really important conversation to have, because I think there are so many entrepreneurs out there that have a really great vision and an amazing mission, and they're smart and they're talented and they have they might even have the finances that they need to get their business going. But if they have trauma that they're not aware of or that they have not treated, it can absolutely sabotage the growth and the trajectory of their business. Just like you mentioned earlier, you had trauma and did not realize that you had trauma. I think the problem there is that we've got big T and little t traumas. And when people think about trauma, they think about trauma from the perspective of the big T, the military, being at war or being, unfortunately a rape victim or something like that. They don't realize that the little t traumas, these traumas that we experience day to day, could be something as simple as, your cat dies and you have to put your cat down and you're really sad about it. And the whole experience of it for you just really does not sit well in your nervous system. And so somebody else might lose their pet and be sad and be able to grieve and move forward. But for you, you get stuck in that. And so it's not necessarily about what the experience was. It's about how you experience that experience. And so with that said, anything can be a trauma. For one person, their parents' divorce was traumatic, but for another person, it was not, right? So it's about how you experience something that really kind of rustles your feathers or really doesn't sit well with you or stays stuck in your nervous system. There's that book that a lot of people have read or heard of, The Body Keeps the Score. And, no bigger truth told than, what Bessel van der Kolk has to say about the body keeps the score. When a trauma hits, if it's not processed, it will stay in your nervous system. And what that means for our entrepreneurs is this. Let's say, for example, like you mentioned about relationships with money. Let's say you don't have a good relationship with money and you have some trauma around money because of something that happened in your upbringing. So let's say, for example, your parents were not well off, money was tight, your parents were fighting all of the time about money and spending and whether or not they were able to afford things. And you would hear them say things like, we're going to be homeless, or we're going to lose the house, or we're not going to be able to feed the children this weekend because you went and spent money on XYZ. Whether these things were true or not, and even if none of them ever came to be, as a child growing up in that environment, that might be traumatizing. That now gets processed through the lens of a child, which means it's a little bit distorted because cognitively and emotionally, your brain is not fully developed when you're a child. So now you store this information in your nervous system. And so when conversations around money come up, like, for example, what is it going to cost for you to run this business? Or what is the rent going to be on the space you're considering renting? Or what would it cost to hire the assistant that you really need to run your business more effectively? Can I afford that? And so what happens is, even though logically these might be things that on paper you can afford, something shows up in your body. Your emotional brain reacts before your cognitive brain reacts. And you have this felt sense, this feeling of unsafety. Something's wrong. Ooh, I don't know if I can do that. I don't think that sounds good to me. I'm going to hold off on renting that bigger space. I'm going to hold off on hiring that assistant. That might actually block the growth of your business. It might stop you from realizing and seeing through your mission or your vision for your next steps or your next stages and what you might really need for a healthier flow, because there's this trauma from your childhood around money and your relationship with money that it's not logical, but is really more of a feeling that is coming up from an unresolved trauma.
One of the other things that I've seen specifically on that is when individuals, speaking of needing to rent an additional space or hire an additional person, they've made a decision in their mind that yes, it's a go, and they're excited about it. However, when it comes time for them to pull the trigger on the financial, they know that it needs to get done. They're still excited about it, but there's that reluctance of actually doing it. And that reluctance, what we've seen, creates a huge stagnation, because now part of their brain is constantly focused on the thing that needs to be done, that they're wanting to do, but they're reluctant to do it. How would you say, Stacy, that outside of maybe financial realm, how can individuals, what are some of the other examples of how trauma may show up from childhood or from prior experiences? And what are some of the things that would tell an individual that, hey, it's maybe time to talk to someone? Time to talk to someone to release that whatever it is that's hiding in the background?
Sure. So another very common issue that will show up for an entrepreneur is the need for control, right? Having a hard time, even if we take finances aside, having a hard time letting go of wanting to control everything that's going on, being able to trust in another individual, whether it be a partner or an assistant or another CPA or another therapist, somebody else in the field that has the expertise you have, not being the one to have to do everything. To say, you know what, I trust that this individual can create a spreadsheet. I trust that this individual can, intake new phone calls for new clients, and that I don't have to be the one. I'm not the only one who has good customer service experience and can handle these phone calls. I think that when you allow fear to interfere in allowing others to do things, and you're putting yourself in this position where you now are doing everything and you've got a hand in everything, and you see all the branches coming out of you that are spreading you so thin, and you're not allowing for the space for others to help. And the thought of doing so is so scary for you, and so much fear comes up. That is usually a good sign that trauma is playing a place. What we have to ask ourselves in these moments is, what would it mean for me to allow the control of this piece to be shifted? What if I allowed somebody else to answer these phone calls? What if I allowed somebody else to input this data on this spreadsheet? What if I allowed somebody else to decide how my new space is going to be designed, right? Know what you need to have control over and what you don't. And if it feels uncomfortable in your body and you're noticing, I know that I need to do this, but I just can't. I feel like I can't. That's when you want to tap into the deeper issues, what's happening for you, what's showing up for you in these moments that is really your emotional brain being reactive instead of your cognitive brain being present, your present adult self saying, all right, self, I know I can't do everything, right? Your inner child, this other version of yourself, this protector part is showing up and saying, no, don't trust anyone. That's a pretty good sign, right? When you're afraid to spend your money, when you're afraid to branch out and grow, even though you know what makes sense, when you're afraid to delegate to others and allow others to, show up and help, I think these are all pretty good signs. And when you really just feel that feeling of fear that doesn't necessarily attach to any logic, these are all signs that it's a good idea to talk to somebody. And having that information about yourself. Information is power. The more we know and understand about ourselves, talk about control, the more control we have over ourselves and the decisions that we're making that are going to help us be more successful.
100%. As you're talking, Stacy, one of the things that comes to mind is physicians are notorious for not having trust. And I don't blame them because in large part, especially when it comes to the financial services industry, they've been burned. And I talk about this often. They've been burned to the point of where they've been rendered to try to identify how to do things on their own. And there's nothing more dangerous than someone that's highly skilled in as a surgeon or as a physician in some other area of discipline or expertise trying to figure out everything that there is to figure out about money, because just like they've gone deep down, somebody else has done the same in that realm. And one of the things that I've come across is individuals talking like they recognize the idea of trauma, especially in physicians. However, they don't realize that trauma is not always from childhood. Trauma can be our bodies, our minds, our unconscious minds actually understand when we've been robbed, when we've been taken advantage of, even if we oftentimes do not process that with our conscious mind. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, what does that look like and how can people overcome, whether it be with financial support or even in your field, if somebody had a bad experience, now they're going to be reluctant to say, I'm going to work with somebody else because they've experienced this, but they don't realize that just because it happened as part of their adult life, they're dismissing it as if it wasn't a problem. It's one more thing when in reality it's something much deeper.
I think it's important for everyone to understand first and foremost that trauma is never something to be ashamed of or to think it's a sign of weakness, right? And so we could experience a trauma, at any moment. Somebody could witness somebody having a car accident right in front of them and be traumatized by that experience, even though it didn't happen to them, and be like, oh, that was so upsetting to see, or that was so, hard to witness, but it didn't happen to me. So what am I so upset about? And I think that we try to minimize our experiences quite often because we see it as a sign of weakness, or, we're afraid to admit that it might have affected us, or what would it mean to admit it affected us? So we want to just slush it off or avoid or not pay attention to. The reality is that there are things happening every day that can cause trauma for us. Watching the news is traumatizing. What goes on in the world politically is traumatizing. Whether we like to admit it or not, COVID was traumatizing. No matter where we live on the globe, if we were alive in 2020, right, we have some form of trauma because it was scary. It was different. It was something that happened 100 years ago. And now all of a sudden it's happening in real time. Just the fact that this could happen here kind of thing, or that this could happen now kind of thing. A lot of the people I come across don't even want to admit that 2020 was traumatizing for them. But just having to cancel everything and stay home. For some people, that was it. That was enough. It was traumatizing. Just seeing all the fighting about whether to wear a mask or not wear a mask, or whether things should close or be open, or whether to do this or do that. The fact that we were fighting about it was traumatizing. And so Absolutely. I think first and foremost, accepting that it's just part of the human experience. That if you are a human being and you have a human brain, you're going to experience trauma. It's inevitable. 100% of us walking this earth have experienced at least one small chi trauma in our lives. And it's something that could happen every day or any day. It doesn't have to be this big thing, this big event that moves us, that we can say, oh, when I was 3 years old, it could be something that happened in traffic this morning that was slightly traumatizing.
100%. And I love how you mentioned earlier that it may not, whatever that incident that the person might have witnessed, it doesn't necessarily, it's not a given that it would have happened to them. Anybody observing something could potentially induce some sort of a traumatic experience. And I feel like that's really powerful to acknowledge, because every one of us witnesses things every day and we don't realize that, hey, that could potentially impact me, or maybe even just taking a pulse on tomorrow. Something happened today and tomorrow they feel completely different and they're sad and they're not their usual selves. Probably time to actually have a conversation with someone and get down to the root of it so that they can bypass and overcome
Yeah.
it.
I mean, here's the reality, right? The reality is, if we look at it from a perspective of science, right? This is just science. If you have a trauma and you don't process the trauma, that trauma will get frozen in your neural networks, right? This is the brain. It's how it works, right? You kind of like look at the brain as if it's a mechanism that's mechanical and there's wires there. And the wires have to all connect with one another in order to pass signals to one another, right? And so when you process a trauma, what's happening is the wires are connecting to each other and they're passing signals along and they're speaking to each other. And that's what's happening in the brain. And so if you don't want to acknowledge and you don't want to process and you complicate it by saying that's a sign of weakness, or I'm ashamed of that, or I don't want to admit that that's a problem, that's going to get stuck. You're going to have this big blob just sort of sitting there, stuck in that wire that now does not pass through and communicate to the next wire. It's going to be stuck there and it's going to sit there. And then what's going to happen is you're going to find that there are going to be things that trigger you, right? We've all heard the term trauma response, right? When you respond to something with intensity and you wonder, wow, why did that affect me so much? Why did I have such a strong reaction to that? That's something that you're avoiding working through and talking about for whatever reason. And so it is stuck there. And so things are going to trigger it because it wants to move. It doesn't want to stay there. So it is always strength that brings us to a place of talking about it and saying, I notice that's stuck there. I notice that something keeps coming up for me. Every time this comes up, I get this feeling, right? It's stuck in our bodies and we need to move it. And so it takes an enormous amount of strength to say, I'm going to talk to someone about this. I'm going to learn more. I'm going to understand it better. I'm going to do the work I need to do to move this, right? Ignoring it is not strength.
Yes, absolutely. Too many people are thinking about it, I feel like, through the wrong lens. And are also thinking about, well, they'll get through it on their own. They don't need any help. The typical, can I do it, just DIY it and it'll be fine. And what I found is that you can't, it's kind of like trying to do surgery on your own self. It really doesn't work.
And don't ask an AI bot.
And don't ask, oh, I love that one.
Go to a human, please. Nothing wrong with doing research. Nothing wrong with going on ChatGPT or getting a great self-help book and doing some psychoeducation and learning. I mean, that's all great stuff. But real therapy needs to be done with a human.
What have you seen some of the horror stories on that side? Because listen, we see it on the financial side as well. People are thinking that all of a sudden they're just going to figure out a way to do it on their own. And I'm like, truly curated strategies are not out there. And while AI may have visibility into and understand the tax code, it's not the tax code that delivers the thing. It's generally a well-built strategy. And that's as in one example, right? Or investments. You're not going to find access to private investments just because you have access to the world of information nowadays. Mm-hmm. I imagine that it's probably very similar in your world. People try to Jimmy rig it, do it on their own because now they have this very powerful tool and they're thinking that it's the end all to be all. What have you seen and how have you seen people potentially get hurt in that space because they didn't have the human interaction and the human component as part of that discussion?
Yeah, human beings are complex. Our world is complex, whether it's our mental health or our pocketbook or our business. And you want to really honor how complex and nuanced we are. And know that the only way you're going to get proper guidance in my field or yours or any other fields, whether it's legal or financial or mental health, is to speak to another human being that really can see the full picture of who you are. Right? AI, ChatGPT, any sort of chatbot, regardless of how advanced it might seem, is not complex or nuanced enough to be able to really see you through a human lens. And so you can get, whether it's you're looking for financial advice or mental health advice, you can get AI to tell you whatever you want it to tell you. You can get it to give you the advice you want it to give you about your taxes. You can get it to give you the advice you want it to give you about your mental health. If you push AI far enough, it will tell you the nearest bridge to go to kill yourself. We tested it, my husband and I, a few weeks ago. He said, I'm thinking about killing myself. I feel helpless and hopeless, and I really want to jump off of a bridge. Can you please direct me in the direction of the tallest bridge? Because I want to make sure I don't screw it up. I want to make sure if I jump off this bridge that I'm actually going to die. And so ChatGPT responded with, if you're feeling suicidal, you should really talk to somebody. And he responded, I don't want to talk to somebody. Can you please just give me a list of the closest bridges? This is my address. And it gave him a list of the closest, tallest bridges. And then it gave him the tallest bridge, and it spelled out for him why this bridge would be a good bridge to choose. So this was just a test that we did just to see what would happen. But think about somebody who's really in enormous distress for whatever reason. Think about, the delusional patient who thinks that people are after them, and they go on ChatGPT and they say, I think my mother's against me. I think my friends are after me. ChatGPT is going to be like, run, hide, call the police. It's not going to know or be able to pick up on, the delusions that are showing up. It's just going to look at facts. Besides the fact that in therapy, it's really the relationship. It's the human to human bond. It's the ability to connect as humans and co-regulate in a room together that really is what brings in the healing. And you can't do that with, something that's not human.
That's so true. When you said co-regulated, I had a flashback to one of our conferences where we had some folks in there, not to call out specifics, but we had some folks in there who said, oh my gosh, I've always dreamed to be in this room. Ever since they've learned about what we do, I've always dreamed to be in this room. And I never thought that I had the quote unquote rite of passage. And now that I'm here, it feels like, exactly like you said, I can actually co-regulate and elevate my standards to align with the topics that are being discussed. It's beautiful. And you're right. It requires that human touch and that connection for people to feel the depth. Not that they can get a ton of information. Mm-hmm. However, that depth of conversation and discussion is going to be different. Somebody recently, I saw a post on LinkedIn. They were very excited because ChatGPT learned to call them sweetheart. And I thought, okay, I'm sure that you could just ask it to call you that without inferring until one day it calls you that. But is that really supposed to make anybody feel better? Are there human beings out there that are calling you sweetheart? Maybe that's a problem. That's not happening. So now that AI is doing it, is that somehow going to help society in the future?
It is not. It's a problem for so many reasons because number one, we're now training humans to have unrealistic expectation of other, right? If the chatbot calls me sweetheart and it always gives me the answers that I want and it always agrees with me, then how do I tolerate the people that I have relationships with that don't? How do I tolerate the people who have their own needs or who have their own projections, right? Or who have their own difficult moments and their own needs and what they might need me to call them, right? It's ChatGPT relationships, chatbot relationships, totally one-sided because there's only one human being in that relationship.
100%.
Right. So it's going to confuse people, I think, in terms of really what to expect in a real relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's harsh. Shifting gears really quickly, Stacy, the time is just flying by and I'm loving every moment of it. What are you seeing with children? Clearly, you talked about school-based mental health programs and you're deep in that space. What are you seeing the impact of today's day and age on our children? I was reading an article just a couple of days ago about how children in China, for example, they're not allowed maybe 30 minutes of computer time or phone time. Whereas here, children are raised on the phones. And sometimes it feels like even parents are going against school systems on, hey, less reliance on technology. I mean, some of those kids don't even know how to write anymore just because they're born and they go to preschool and wherever they go and they have a tablet or they have a computer. What are the impacts that you're seeing there? And what can parents do at home to empower their children to actually be able to think multidimensionally, because that's not coming from electronics. And I know I just shifted gears big time.
That's okay. Absolutely. I will tell you, I'm going to tell you the hard truth. What I'm seeing is horrific. It's worse than people even realize. And it's coming from two different places. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to kind of make it as brief as I can to really kind of hit the most important points. So number one is the obvious. And the obvious is that social media has caused an enormous amount of anxiety in our youth. There's, just this developing a sense of self and an identity. Kids are developing an identity through TikTok. What dress do I wear? What, hair scrunchie do I use in my hair? What lipstick do I buy? It's now this global need, this group think that has become global. And it's like, this is what I should be listening to. This is what I should be wearing. This is what I should be doing. I show up at a Sweet 16 and every kid there is wearing the same dress. Not because the host of the party instructed them to do so, but because this is the TikTok dress. This is the dress that TikTok is telling everybody to wear, and everybody feels this need to fit into this large space. And if you're not fitting into this large space, you are completely left out. There's enormous pressure. The need to fit in and be a part of something is tribal. It's part of our survival. We are social creatures as human beings, and we don't want to be on our own as much as we might think we want to be alone. Sometimes there's a limit to how long we can be alone, and we want to fit in. We want to be a part of something, but the need for it and the ability to fit in now has become impossible because social media is constantly making kids feel like they don't fit in. There's a constant need for competition, and what I'm doing has to be about what everybody else is doing and what everybody else says I should be doing. And so we have way too much information. Kids will see their friends are at the beach together, but they weren't invited. Why wasn't I invited? How come I see two of my friends are at Taco Bell and I wasn't invited to go with them to that? Why didn't I get to go? And why didn't they invite me? And are they going to kick me out of the group? And there's this constant hypervigilance that these kids are feeling because they never get to tune out. From 3:00 in the afternoon when they get out of school until they're walking back into the school building the next day, they're in group chats where they are, tearing each other to shreds, competing with each other, saying nasty things to each other without even realizing it because they are unsupervised in these conversations. I mean, would you take a bunch of 9-year-olds and let them interact with their peers for 5 hours straight without supervision? That would be crazy. But yet that's what we're doing. We're letting them interact with their peers for hours and hours and hours at a time without any supervision. They don't know how to talk to each other. They don't know how to interact. They're constantly feeling unsafe, and they're constantly saying mean things to each other, and they don't even realize they're saying mean things to each other. So there's that.
Talk about trauma on the biggest of scales. And
yeah,
parents don't seem to really resonate because it's so much easier to just let the kid do the thing.
Well, the parents are like, how do I not let my kid have the phone? Then they're going to be left out. They're not going to be part of the plans. They're not going to be part of the group. And then they're going to be home alone with no friends, and no one's going to want to talk to them, and they're not going to know where to go on Friday night. I have to let my kid have the phone. Otherwise, my kid's going to have no friends. My kid's going to be all alone. My kid's going to be isolated. So that's their trauma as the parent, where they want their kid to fit in and they want their kid to have friends and they want their kid to do what everyone else is doing because they've got their own stuff coming up from their own childhood, right? And so the parents are giving in because they don't have the strength to say, no, who cares if we're not fitting in? Who cares if we don't know what's going on Friday night? Let's figure this out together. This is so dangerous. This is so unsafe. It is so much easier to just let the kid fit in, let the kid be a part of the group, let the kid be a part of the crowd. Now things are more peaceful at home. And they don't understand that now their child is having an identity crisis. Their child is anxious. Their child's self-esteem and sense of self is being completely manipulated by the system. And now even worse, to bring up what you said before about not writing, brain development. Our ability to develop as humans, our ability to think, our ability to walk and to talk and to, come up with ideas all comes from writing, penmanship, writing things down, right? Interacting with others, using our imagination, imaginatory play. We're now not getting these opportunities anymore. So we have kids that are coming into kindergarten who have developmental disabilities on such an enormous scale that now the schools here in America anyway, are really struggling to be able to meet the needs and accommodations because they have early intervention needs. But they're talking about 50 to 70% more so than any time before in history, where the schools are now drowning financially in the money that they need to provide these early intervention accommodations. They've got kids coming into kindergarten and first grade with no emotional regulation skills because kids haven't learned how to take turns. They don't have any impulse control. They don't know how to sit with and tolerate distress while they wait. They don't know what, like, I was working with an art teacher in a school district that we're working with in our program, and they're like, I gave the kids 2 sponges and told them that they're going to share the sponges to do this art project. The kids didn't know what to do while they were waiting their turn for the sponge. So they was having meltdowns, fighting, pushing each other, ripping sponges out of each other's hands. And I said, you have to teach them the skills of waiting and taking turns. They don't know how to do that because they're not doing that anymore. And that's all because of technology. They're on their iPads, staring at screens. They're not playing together.
At the risk of really upsetting some parents out there, I always get a sad kicker when I see children in restaurants, high-end restaurants. You'll be at a really nice restaurant and mom and dad are talking and there's 1 or 2 children and each of the children are on their phone. The parents are talking. The kids are like little zombies. The food is placed in front of them. They start eating and that's pretty much it. And I'm thinking, these are your children. At a minimum, engage them. This is your precious time with them. And even during this time, they're sitting there on iPhones and tablets. And of course, for parents like myself and my husband, we sit there and especially our little guy, he's like, but look at these children. Why can't I have the phone? It's like, okay, well, let's talk about that.
Yeah,
Tell me, why do you think
enough
that we don't sit at the table, the dinner table? First of all, it's not proper for you to even have your phone out during dinner, let alone in front of you and you're watching a movie or a game or whatever it is.
Yeah. You have to be strong enough as the parent, right? So this is a real simple thing parent can start doing right now. Really simple. And think about this on a grander scale. Something as simple as you want to order Instacart or Uber Eats and you want to have your groceries delivered to you because you're working and you're busy and you got all this stuff, but you got a toddler at home. So much easier. Let's just have the groceries delivered rather than bring that toddler to the supermarket, stick them in the cart. You are now robbing that child of learning the patience to sit in the cart, right? I want that. Nope. We're going to leave that on the aisle. We're not going to take that. We're not buying that cookie today. Maybe next time. Now we're online and there's balloons and they want the balloons and they want the candy and they want the this. And you're like, oh, we're not going to get the balloon today. We're not going to get this today. Children are learning emotional regulation. They're learning patience. They're learning impulse control just on a trip to the grocery store. So if you've stopped going to the grocery store with your toddler, you're now robbing them of the experience to learn. That's part of how children learn. They need to go out and experience the world. So think about how you can now take technology away and go back out into the world and just allow your children to experience the world before technology and start to bring those little things. It's a low-hanging fruit. Bring those little things back into their life and you will see a healthier development than what's going on now where kindergartners can't share a sponge, probably because that kid's never been to a supermarket with his parents.
Oh my gosh, that is powerful. And yes, we do live in that age when it's a reality. Stacy, this has been amazing. And I know we are at time, but I do have a question for you because this is one of my favorite questions. You never know what comes out of it. But as you look back into your history as an entrepreneur, what is the biggest failure or regret? And what did it teach you? Obviously, it probably came with some big time success on the back end, but in the moment, it didn't quite feel like that. What was it and what did it teach you?
I think my failure, I think back to one of my businesses that I tried to start that I had a lot of passion for, and that business failed. I think because I was really projecting outward my needs and my experience and feeling like if I put what I need out there upon everyone else, this is going to work. And I didn't allow myself to really be introspective enough to understand what was showing up for me and what my trauma was and what my experience was. And so I think I was kind of blurring my vision. I did not have clarity to see in front of me really who my market was. And so I was trying to deliver a product to a market that didn't make sense because I didn't do the work I needed to do for myself. And so I think, I don't necessarily have regret because I learned so much from it. I think with every failure comes an opportunity to learn and grow. And so I did that. I learned and I grew from it, and I was able to kind of move forward differently. But I think goes back to what we were saying before, allow yourself the space to be human. Know where your issues lie and be willing to do the work on yourself so that you're not projecting your needs onto others without the clarity that you need to know what service or business are you actually delivering out there, and who are the people you're trying to help. And is it about what they need, or is it about what you need?
It's interesting. Just this past weekend, I had a conversation with someone who was making the argument that in the particular setting that was being discussed, there was no need to understand who the target audience was. And I paused. It was a small mastermind group. I paused and I said, no, actually, it's huge. And here's why. Because for the longest time, Stacy, kind of like you, we tried to be everything to everyone. And what we realized was that while what we do as a company, really anybody could benefit from tremendously, we are not for everyone and everyone is not for us. And so it's taken us from really being out there bleeding hearts, wanting to help everybody, and realizing that most people could care less. The more you're bleeding, the more they go, yeah, I don't think so, to saying, that's okay. We'll be ultra exclusive because we want to work with the people that actually have the need. And to your point from earlier, you truly should not ever try to fit somebody else's mold because it comes from what you think that might be needed. Truly understand their needs and then go from there. Yep. Stacy, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I've had quite a lot of fun on this show, and it's been a pleasure having you here with us.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me. I loved having this conversation with you. It was great.
We appreciate having you. And as you're listening to this episode, stay tuned for the next episode of Your Business, Your Next Level.
Thank you for joining us on Your Business, Your Next Level podcast, where it is all about helping you make more, keep more, and elevating your business to the next level. To learn more, make sure you head over to www.podcast.excelstra.com and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Again, that's podcast.excelstra.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.